Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation today. I want to first begin by thanking our partners who have made this briefing possible. First, we greatly appreciate the attendance of Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, and Congresswoman Grace Meng of New York. We appreciate your demonstrated commitment and leadership by joining us today. And second, we extend our gratitude to our three guest speakers, Mr. Harpreet Singh Saini of the Oak Creek, Wisconsin Sikh community, Pastor Eric S.C. Manning, the senior pastor of the historic Mother Emanuel A.M.E. Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and Rabbi Jeffrey Meyers, the Rabbi and Cantor for Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All three of the communities that our featured speakers represent have experienced profound tragedy. We are convening this briefing and coming together as we reflect on the mass shooting at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek 10 years ago on August 5th, 2012. 7 Sikh worshippers' lives were ultimately lost as a result of that attack, with others still injured. The pain subsequently experienced by Pastor Manning and Rabbi Myers communities are a deeply sad testament to the fact that not enough was done after Oak Creek to better protect our houses of worship. 2012 was an early warning of further targeted attacks of mass violence to come. As a result of continued inaction, 9 Black worshipers were shot to death in Charleston in 2015, and 11 Jewish worshipers were killed in Pittsburgh in 2018. These numbers, while horrific, also don't capture the depth of pain, loss, and trauma experienced by the survivors and their families. So we're here today to talk about what comes next. What are the lessons that we've learned from the past 10 years, and how can Congress take action to prevent the next Oak Creek, the next Charleston, or the next Pittsburgh? Our communities should not mourn in vain. Our pain must turn to action. And while there are so many possible policy improvements to explore, the Sikh Coalition believes that 3 pieces of legislation already familiar to Congress could help save more lives and make communities safer from harm. They include passing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would create better federal standards for appropriate investigation of white nationalist and supremacist groups, and implement several common sense processes to combat white supremacy, while not unintentionally targeting racial and religious groups who have borne unintended consequences of previous national security responses. Second, passing the Nonprofit Security Grant Program Improvement Act, which would make more resources readily available to gurdwaras, synagogues, mosques, churches, and other nonprofit institutions that wish to invest in strengthening themselves against potential violent acts and attacks. And reintroducing and passing the Justice for Victims of Hate Crimes Act, which would close a loophole in the law that currently prohibits the Department of Justice from prosecuting the majority of hate crimes in this country. We look forward to discussing these recommendations and more today. By way of preview of our agenda, we expect members of Congress will trickle in and deliver remarks as they are available. We will also have a conversation featuring our 3 speakers, moderated by our Sikh Coalition's Senior Policy and Advocacy Manager, Sim J. Singh Atariwala. During that portion of our program, attendees can ask questions by using the question feature in Zoom, so please be sure to do that. With that, I am honored to introduce the first of our congressional speakers. Congresswoman Grace Meng is a trailblazer as the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State, and serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is vice chair of its subcommittee on state and foreign operations. She has also helped pass several pieces of legislation into law to help our communities, including the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, and most recently, a commission to study the potential creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture Act. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the Sikh Coalition for putting together this important and unfortunately still ever so timely event. I am a Congresswoman representing parts of Queens, New York. I'm proud to represent an area with a large and vibrant and compassionate and warm Sikh American community. Honored to be here with some of my other colleagues in government who will be stopping in as well. And really proud to be part of this important event as we truly rely on solidarity to battle this hate that continues to plague our nations, and grateful for interfaith conversations like this panel. It's truly the solidarity that will help us to make progress together and forward. We want to make sure that we are spreading information about the legislation that was just mentioned and what we can do to help pass it and help push for legislation, not just in one community, but across communities, because hate and discrimination towards any one community can easily be targeted towards any other community. Back here in our home district in New York, we are proud to work with many of our houses of worship to talk about programs like our nonprofit security grant program that are available to houses of worship. And we've been working with many communities like the Jewish community to get the word out to newer houses of worship or unconventional recipients who are able to get this money. We have workshops and webinars to make sure that people know about these grant applications, money that comes directly from the federal government. And we worked last year to increase this amount so that there can be more houses of worship that receive the funding. And as we talk about hate crimes, which is often obviously at the back end of the problem, we cannot talk about this without talking about the importance of education. We have to work together across communities to address the root causes of so much of this bigotry. Education is so important. There's a lot of conversation about increasing the need for more diverse curriculum in our basic K through 12 education. We have legislation that is pending federally, but we know that there are many states who are working on including AAPI curriculum and including contributions and trauma that the Sikh American community has gone through right here in our own country. We're proud to work with all of you in passing our AAPI museum bill into law. President Biden signed it into law a few weeks ago, and some of you were at the White House to celebrate with us. And we hope one day that as we talk about combating bigotry, that we are talking about our collective and diverse AAPI experiences for everyone, from our students right here in this country to tourists who may one day visit our museum and understand that our experiences are just as American as everyone else's. So thank you so much for your continued work. And I do really want to also thank people like Harpreet Singh Saini and Pastor Manning and Rabbi Myers for turning your pain and your trauma into healing and finding ways for all of us to come together and to make sure that these tragedies don't happen to other communities in the future. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Grace Meng, for joining us. We know how valuable your time is, and we appreciate you taking that moment to talk to us about this important legislation and the important work you are doing across the board. I want to take this moment now to hand it over to Sim, who is our moderator for the panel. And again, as other Congress people roll in, other senators, members of Congress roll in, we will take a pause during the panel to introduce them and have them speak. So Sim, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's briefing. It's our hope that today's briefing will bring a perspective to Hill staff on the challenges for minority communities who are caught between the crosshairs of white supremacist violence. We hope to connect the dots between Oak Creek, Charleston, and Pittsburgh, and so many other minority faith communities who've endured tragedy. These perspectives will highlight the personal narratives of the lingering effects attacks on their houses of worship have had on their communities, and also illustrate the viewpoints on initiatives on prevention and protection. Policy highlights, like Anisha had shared, will focus on some of the federal responses to white supremacist violence, which has been largely unaddressed, and hate crimes. The challenges with security hardening initiatives such as the Nonprofit Security Grant Improvement Program, and then the systemic challenges that result in a prolonged climate of hatred and division, similar to the solutions that Congresswoman Grace Meng had just recently outlined, such as improving education initiatives so that we can root out some of the base causes for bigotry, hate, and division. Joining me at today's panel is Harpreet Singh Saini. He's the son of Paramjit Kaur, who was one of the 7 Sikhs killed at the August 5th, 2012 mass shooting at the Sikh Temple of Oak Creek, Wisconsin. At the time, his mother's murder, Harpreet was 18 years old. Weeks later, he testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. His account spurred elected officials to finally require the Federal Bureau of Investigations to start tracking anti-Sikh hate crimes and bias incidents. Another panelist joining us today is Pastor Eric S.C. Manning, senior pastor of the historic Mother Emanuel A.M.E. Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where 9 persons were shot to death on June 17, 2015. In his capacity, Pastor Manning has been responsible for leading the congregation on a journey of healing and recovery. He's worked with the National Crime Victim Research and Treatment Center of the Medical University of South Carolina to ensure that comprehensive services were available to the survivors, families, and the community at large. And last but not least, Rabbi Hassan, Dr. Jeffrey Meyers, has served as the Rabbi and Cantor for Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh since the summer of 2017. He moved to the city of Bridges after spending decades in ministry in New Jersey and Long Island. After the horrific morning of October 27, 2018, when a heavily armed gunman began a murderous rampage in the Tree of Life Synagogue, Rabbi Myers, who survived the attack, became the face of the tragedy. Since then, he set about sending the key messages that love is stronger than hate. Rabbi Myers has frequently shared that his view on national media outlets, while acknowledging that a lack of understanding of our neighbors leads to fear and sometimes loathing. Fear leads to the H word, as he likes to say. The H word leads to acts of violence. Rabbi Myers believes that if we're ever to remove the H word from our society, it must start with the pledging not to use the word in speech, just as he's done in honor of the 11 precious lives lost at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Panelists, welcome today. We really appreciate you joining us. I want to start today's conversation with a question for all of the panelists. It's an important discussion, and our communities have faced unspeakable tragedies and trauma in our houses of worship, places that are meant to be safe havens and sanctuaries. And the hope is that with this conversation, we can reflect on where things stand as it relates to keeping our communities safe, sharing how the communities impacted are still grappling with the after effects of the attack, and identifying ways to honor those affected by mass violence. I'm honored to moderate today's panel with these distinguished speakers. Let's begin with Rabbi Myers. I'd love to start by asking you each to introduce yourself and what brings you to this conversation. Rabbi Myers.
Thank you, Sim. First, I want to just thank Congresswoman Meng for finding time in a busy schedule to share remarks with us. And it's encouraging to have a willing partner in Congress from the API community to be part of this conversation. So what brings me to participate in this? My relationships to the community in Oak Creek go back quite a number of years to a number of events that occurred, frankly, after the massacre in my congregation, where the Sikh community reached out to us instantly, both locally as well as nationally. That's when I came to learn that we have so much more in common than what separates us. It's that commonality that created one brotherhood. They warmly welcomed me into, as I've said, a club that nobody wants to belong to, and came to realize that there was much strength I could draw upon from that community to help me in my processes of grieving, mourning, and moving forward. And alas, how we take that joint strength and work to help other communities, because this just hasn't stopped. So I'm a grateful and willing partner to lend my voice to find ways that we can move forward together with strength.
Thank you, Rabbi. Harpreet, I want to turn it over to you next.
Hey, my name is Harpreet Singh Saini. I am here today because my mother was murdered in an act of hate 3,642 days ago. As you all know, the attack on our Gurdwara, the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, happened on August 5th, 2012. Just weeks afterward, I testified before the Senate and called for action. In the decade since, not enough has changed. I asked the government to give my mother the dignity of being a statistic, to begin tracking anti-Sikh hate crimes. The FBI began that tracking a couple of years later, and I'm grateful for that. But there has been little action since then. The number of hate crimes continues to rise every year. In the meantime, more mass shootings have taken more Americans and from more communities. At the time, the attack in Oak Creek was one of the deadliest assaults on a house of worship in our nation's history. Now I'm joined today by two religious leaders whose own community lost peaceful worshipers in attack just a few years later. My mother, Paramjit Kaur, was a hardworking woman. She was smart. She was warm and loving. She gave her all every day so that my brother and I could have opportunities that she never did. As I told the senators before, nearly 10 years ago, the gunman who took her life may have been full of hate, but my mother was full of love. I miss her so much. Too many Americans know that feeling, the feeling of having someone taken away from them. This is why I'm here today once again, to call for action from our government. We must stop this cycle of hate, fear, loss, and pain. We can choose to do so today. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpreet, for those powerful words. Pastor Manning, I want to turn it over to you. What brings you to this conversation?
Well, again, I would thank Representative Grace Meng for lending her voice as well, and to dear friends. I love what Rabbi said, the one brotherhood. So a year after the tragedy of June 17th, 2015, I came to serve Mother Emanuel as their pastor. And to the point that was made a few moments ago as well, we thought that would be, the end. And we worked on ministering and sharing with the local community and the church in recovery. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, we became aware of the massacre there at the Tree of Life. And one thing that I understood when I came to serve Mother Emanuel is that there were not that many folks who I was able to reach out to lend or to learn from. So it was in that vein I reached out to Rabbi Jeffrey Meyers, just to lend a voice and to say that we're here, that you're not alone. And in that particular perspective, I began to embrace what we have now referred to as the ministry of presence, of standing with communities who go through these type of hateful acts where racism comes up and we are murdered because of either our religious affiliation, our color. And in that particular vein, I try to be there to listen and to be a part of the collective body, to share and to say enough is enough. We do need to begin to look for ways that we could decrease the amount of hateful speech that continues to be promoted and promulgated through our media, through social media, et cetera. And we have to find ways that draw us all together. And again, like I said, I like what Rabbi said, the one brotherhood concept. I always say meeting each other on the basis of our humanity, embracing our differences, getting to know who our neighbor is, and honoring our neighbor with as much dignity and respect as we possibly can. That is, of course, what is required. So whenever we have an opportunity to share our voice, to add to the collective discussion, we're going to be there because we must continue to remind the communities, not only that we serve, but also throughout this land, that love is stronger than hate. And we must be willing to meet each other on the basis of our collective humanity. And as we can do such, so we can come together and learn from one another and respect one another, and then grow our communities so that way they'll be stronger, better than ever before. So again, I thank you for your leadership and the invitation that you extended to us to be a part of this wonderful discussion today. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing what brings you to today's conversation. And for all of our attendees, as a reminder, you can submit questions in the chat, and we will get to a couple of those at the end of the program. So feel free to drop those down, and we will select a couple to propose to our panelists today. Harpreet, I want to turn it back to you. The tragic shooting in Oak Creek happened in 2012, and we're now marking the 10-year anniversary. I know our organization continues to work closely with Oak Creek Sikh community leaders to support efforts to commemorate the anniversary in Oak Creek next week. And we continue to be humbled by the strength of the community. Can you tell us what the last 10 years have meant for the Oak Creek Sikh community?
For those of us who lost loved ones, it means missing them and honoring their memories every day. For our Gurdwara, it has meant real changes. We have to be more cautious in welcoming people. We have a security guard and someone always watching the cameras. This is sad because Gurdwaras are supposed to be open to anyone. But now we know we have to be prepared. Honestly, sometimes it feels like what happened in Oak Creek was ignored. It has been really painful to watch other communities like Pittsburgh and Charleston go through what we went through. We have this horrible experience that we all shared, but it isn't something that you want anyone else to go through.
Absolutely agree with you, Harpreet. Pastor Manning, you just spoke a little bit about this, and I want to provide a little bit of background and context that I think might be helpful for those who are joining us today. Your church is one of the oldest Black churches in the United States and has long been a center for organizing civil rights events. One distinguishing factor in the coverage of the shooting at your church was the treatment of the attacker by law enforcement and the media. As your congregation recently honored the 7th year of remembrance, the lives lost, are there reflections you want to share on the biased coverage and handling of the hate violence of perpetrators?
Well, and Sim, I thank you for that wonderful question. And while it is immensely painful to kind of revisit from time to time, we must acknowledge that there is a perceived difference in the ways that certain individuals are treated after a heinous act has been committed. Of course, immediately following, Dylan Roof was located and was taken into custody without much fanfare. He had, memory serves me correctly, the weapon still on his person. Law enforcement pulled him over and began to take him out of his vehicle. Again, no guns drawn, just taking him out of his vehicle with not much fanfare. Recently, of course, in Pittsburgh, that was the same thing. The person who, after not Pittsburgh, excuse me, Buffalo, after the shooting therein, again, the perpetrator was taken into custody without much fanfare. We later, of course, became aware of the fact that Dylan Roof was taken to Burger King and got something to eat. I understood maybe from that what the prosecutors were saying, that they wanted to treat the person fair, so that way they would not have any type of appeal later on saying that they mistreated the person who committed the act. But I think there's a distinct difference. You kill 9 worshipers in a Bible study. You kill people in a supermarket who happen to be African American, people of color, and you're taken into custody without much fanfare. Whereas even a couple of weeks ago, when a person was running away from the police, was shot 40 some odd times. There's a difference. And some people may say, well, Pastor, it's not really, a real difference. It's a perceived. No, the facts dictate that when crimes are committed against people of color, law enforcement from time to time handles it differently. Now, I must pause and say that I'm not anti-police or anti-law enforcement. I applaud first responders. I am thankful for the way that they respond, not just to here at Mother Emanuel, but all across, rushing into dangerous situations. But we must acknowledge that there is still a difference in the way that Black and brown people are treated, or those who carry out these acts of hate and racial acts of hate against the Black and brown community. Those perpetrators are treated differently. And at times we wonder, are there 2 laws that people are on the receiving end of? Whereas if you are if you are Caucasian, you're treated differently when you carry out an act that is filled with hate, versus someone who may be innocent running away. And then, of course, they are indeed killed. We saw what happened with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, with Ahmaud Arbery. We see that on a regular basis. And unfortunately, it is something that we still have to acknowledge. And then we must do our very best to make sure that there is no bias when it comes to the way that we treat people who carry out these heinous acts. Again, life is indeed sacred. Everyone's life matters. And we must acknowledge first and foremost that there is a difference, and then have the courage that we need to have the discussion to make sure that we do whatever is possible to ensure that this no longer happens.
Thank you, Pastor Manning. I think that is a sobering reality for many of our communities that needs to be heard. And Rabbi, I think Pastor Manning touched on this. It's been nearly 4 years since the shooting on your synagogue. It sadly was the deadliest attack on a Jewish house of worship in the United States. How has the response been since? Do you think there were differences in how our society, including politicians, responded to the act of terror inflicted?
Thank you. And yes, an important question. And thank you, Pastor Manning, for such a powerfully, brutally honest, yet fair assessment. I think there was a difference. And I think that difference can be attributed to, as regrettably were labeled, the most severe attack ever in a synagogue in the United States. And because of that, I think there's been a different sort of impact. Sometimes it may seem unfair and uneven when compared to not just other houses of worship, but any sort of mass shooting or singular shooting that sometimes there seems to be an inequality. But that being said, to focus, at least initially, on the city of Pittsburgh, I can say that the response was incredible. And I say incredible because I'm not native to Pittsburgh. I'm an immigrant. So I really was not that familiar with Pittsburgh, having only been here for 1 year. But I found that all peoples responded as though it was a personal attack. And it did not matter your house of worship, the color of your skin, your sexual orientation. None of that mattered. People all responded in kind, opening doors that perhaps would have never opened, to extend any and all offers of help, whatever that could be. Cannot tell you how many houses of worship offered their own facilities for us to have prayer services, because our building remains closed as we're in the process of a rebuild, renew campaign. And that continues to this day. Communities of all groups continue to reach out. What I found then is, since Pittsburgh is known as the city of bridges, with 446 bridges, but still there weren't enough. There need to be bridges of understanding and of goodwill with all communities within Pittsburgh. I'm trying as best as I can to respond to those doors that open and make those bridges two-way streets, to respond in kind, to work with all of these willing partners, to acknowledge that we're all in this together, to be able to work together. So I think Pittsburgh can be an interesting model and also laboratory for the types of changes that are necessary across America, to be able to experiment with a number of initiatives here to see what might work, how might those be better formed after we sort of beta test them here, and then expand and grow them and find ways that we can help other communities. Because sadly, as I think we all know, it's not that we sit and wait, but we all know there's going to be another attack somewhere. It's just a matter of time. If you follow the news, this past Sunday, in I think it's a Black church, Pastor Manning, in Brooklyn, the bishop was preaching when armed individuals entered and committed robbery in the middle of his sermon. And you think to yourself, whatever happened to the concept of sanctuary, which is from the Latin sanctus, meaning holy, sacred, that our sacred spaces are no longer safe. So really on a federal level, people are feeling less secure in their faiths and in publicly expressing that devotion. That's, I think, where our federal government needs to come in. Because if life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is supposed to be a guarantee, shall we say, in the Declaration of Independence, it seems more like a wishful thinking, because unless there are steps that any American can be able to worship as they choose in safety and security, none of us are safe. So I think, even though I experienced so much love and support here, that in itself doesn't change the brutal realities, which, as we just saw in Brooklyn on Sunday, underline that there is so much more that needs to be done, that we need our federal government to step in to secure that everyone can practice their faith in safety and security.
Thank you, Rabbi. I do think it's an important and timely mention of just how houses of worship are facing all sorts of risks and threats. We know that a Gurdwara in Washington was recently vandalized as well, and had items stolen from it. And there's, I think, a worrying trend, not just in hate violence, but also just petty crimes that are happening against these kinds of houses of worship. But I know today's briefing is focused, I think, on white supremacy and hate violence. And specifically, this is a question for all three of the panelists, and I'll share which one of you I want to answer first. But white supremacy has been a long problem for our nation and communities. For the Black community, it's been a lived experience for more than 200 years in this country. Rabbi Myers, you alluded to this. The Jewish community fled Nazis and fascists, but are now confronted with deadly anti-Semitism in a nation that promised safe harbor from religious persecution. For Sikhs and others from Asia migrating to the United States, we have faced violent backlash since the late 1800s because of a false notion that we are not Americans, but rather perpetual foreigners. The documented increase in hate violence over the last decade that we have seen brings us to an inflection point in this country. From your perspectives, what are the deep-rooted issues that you believe contribute to the rise in hate violence and attacks on our houses of worship? Harpreet, I want to open it with you because I think your comments in our conversations, I think, align nicely with some of the remarks that Congresswoman Grace Meng had opened us up with. Harpreet, turn it over to you.
For Sikhs, education is a big part of it. People need to know who Sikh are, what we believe, and how long we've been in this country, part of this country. Politicians also need to be careful about how they speak about foreigners and threats, and who belong in America. Some Americans still don't think we belong, even after we been in this country for more than 100 years. White supremacists killed my mother and 6 other members of our community. He was openly involved in an extremely violent organization. The federal government must do more to stop these groups.
Thank you, Harpreet, for reminding us all that education is certainly a factor, and that some of these hate actors are open and notorious. They're not in hiding. They're right there under our noses sometimes. Pastor Manning, I want to turn it over to you. From your perspectives, what are the deep-rooted issues that you think are contributing to this rise in attacks on our houses of worship?
I think Harpreet is right, is spot on in his earlier remarks. I think realistically, it has to be this understanding, once again, through education, that there's more that unites us and divides us. I know a lot of times we always focus on what divides us, but realistically, we have to learn that everyone who is in this country or throughout the world, it is connected by our basic human dignity and human rights. We are all equal in that regard. I know sometimes people will say, well, no, that we're different from our borders and things of that magnitude, but I would want to believe that any father would want to see their child grow. Harpreet was sharing with the pain and the anguish of his mother being taken away prematurely. I am sure that across this world, any son who has to lose the loss of a mother is going to mourn. When we begin to understand that we all suffer and we all have pain, and when one is hurt, then many are hurt, then you're able to come together in that regard. The other thing, not just from education perspective, but what is also important is those who are in elected officials must set an example. The way they speak to one another, the way they treat one another, the way they accept one another. They may be Republican, they may be Democrat, they may be from one state or the other state, they may be different, but at the end of the day, they are our elected officials who must be mature enough to set an example, to not use negative rhetoric, hateful speech. Excuse me, Rabbi, I know you don't like the H word, hateful speech, things of that magnitude. They have to set an example. And I know a lot of times we want legislation to take place, but I would just think that if we turn on the TV and we see our elected officials treating one another with dignity and respect and honor, then people will begin to understand that the negative rhetoric and hateful speech is no longer welcomed in a public forum. And then once we do that, we can begin to dismantle all of the animosity that is there, the hate that is there, and we can then begin to meet and respect each other on the basis of our collective humanity and dignity. I think that is very important. Somewhere along the lines, we have to reclaim our dignity for one another. I respect the entire community. Why? Because we are all a part of this community. We are all a part of collective humanity. But we have to have the courage to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to respond that way. No, we can't talk like that anymore. We need to be leaders. We need to be mature leaders. We need to show that even though we come from different parts of life, different walks and different, a political affiliation, we can embrace one another because we know that we are all in this together. I like the quote Martin Luther King shared. We may have gotten to this country in different boats, but we are all now in the same boat together.
Thank you, Pastor Manning. And Rabbi, before I come back to you, I wanted to turn it to Anisha Singh to introduce our next congressional speaker. Anisha.
Thank you so much, Sim, and thank you so much to our panelists for this powerful, emotional, and necessary conversation, which I'm excited to get back to. But we have a special guest joining us. I'm honored to introduce Senator Dick Durbin, who is the chair of the United States Senate Committee on the Judiciary. If it was not for his leadership, the FBI would not have begun tracking anti-Sikh hate crimes following the testimony of Harpreet Singh Saini. He has also helped author the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act to create better federal standards for appropriate investigation of white nationalist and supremacist groups and implement several common sense processes to combat white supremacy, while not unintentionally targeting racial and religious groups who have borne unintended consequences of previous national security responses. Thank you so much, Senator Durbin, for joining us today. I want to hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to thank Anisha Singh for that generous introduction. And I want to thank the Sikh Coalition for inviting me to be here today and for the work you've done to combat discrimination and hate. I want to particularly recognize one of your panelists today, Harpreet Singh Saini. 10 years ago, after a white supremacist murdered 7 Sikh worshippers at the Oak Creek, Wisconsin Gurdwara, I held a hearing on the threat of domestic terrorism. Mr. Singh Saini had just lost his mother in that horrible shooting, but he came to Washington, D.C. to testify because he wanted us to know about his mother. I'll never forget his brave testimony. Sadly, 10 years later, the threat of that day has only grown worse. In the decades since Oak Creek, violent white supremacists have killed innocent Americans in a series of disgusting attacks at houses of worship. These include mass shootings at the Emanuel A.M.E. Church in South Carolina in 2015, Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, and the Poway, California Synagogue in 2019. Since I became chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee last year, I've had a series of hearings on the domestic terrorism threat, a threat that is, in the words of our FBI Director, Christopher Wray, I quote him now, metastasizing across America. Our most recent hearing was just last month after the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. A white supremacist marched into Tops grocery store and massacred 10 Black Americans in cold blood. Why is this happening in America? What can we do about it? We cannot deny that hate has a big platform. And I'm going to name some names. There are politicians and media figures like Tucker Carlson, who are dragging racist conspiracy theories into mainstream conversation. More than 400 episodes of Tucker Carlson's show have amplified the so-called Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is the guiding principle of the modern white supremacist movement. Elected officials and other public figures must speak with one voice in repudiating this incendiary rhetoric, along with any individual or extremist group who adheres to it. And while there are no simple solutions for addressing violent extremism, a promising starting point is the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which I first introduced in 2017. I'm sad to say the Senate has been unable to move this forward on my bill earlier this year, but I'm not giving up. I remember, just to ad lib here for a moment, I remember in 9/11 receiving a visit from a college student. She was from Chicagoland area, was going to college at George Washington University. And she said to me, the Senate has passed a resolution condemning discrimination and hatred against the Muslim people. But I can tell you that my people are facing it too. And I'm hoping you'll consider a similar resolution. I said I would, and I did, and we passed it, as it should have been passed. The second part of that story is equally touching. It was within days after the 9/11 attack. The airports were finally open. And I took an airplane from Washington to O'Hare. I was going to catch a cab and I went out to the cab line. And as I walked down the cab line, I saw one of the cab drivers with a turban on his head. And he was the next in line, and I opened the door and got in. And we started to drive, and I said, are you running into any trouble because of 9/11? Oh, he says, some people refuse to get in my cab, and some of them give me the finger and walk away. But by and large, people are okay. I said, well, that's good to hear. He said, I want to show you something. I didn't tell him I was a senator. He said, I want to show you something. He reached over and he pulled down the visor on the passenger side. And there was a young man in a US Army military uniform with a turban on his head. And I said, who's that? He said, that's my son. He's serving in the United States Army. I said, where is he stationed? He said, well, he's on a special forces assignment. He can't even tell me where he's going. And I said, well, it's amazing. He said, the people who are treating me so badly after 9/11 ought to know that my son is in the battle for the United States. I've told that story 100 times because I think it tells a great story about America and about the determination of everyone, despite discrimination, despite the negative things they may hear, to be an active and valuable part of this nation. I was glad to introduce that original resolution and happy to tell that story time and again. There's more work to do, and as chairman of Judiciary, I hope to work with you to achieve those goals.
Thank you so much, Senator Durbin, for both your inspirational words, but also your time and joining us today for this important conversation. I know I speak for all of our panelists and attendees in thanking you for all of your work on the legislation that has impacted and helped our communities, and all of the work that you are going to be continuing to do to speak for all of us on the Senate floor. So thank you so much, Senator, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
While we have you, I also wanted to introduce a video submission from Senator Gary Peters. He was hoping to make it live, but has submitted a video, and we are grateful for him taking that time and giving us some of his inspirational words as well. So without further ado, Senator Gary Peters is the chair of the United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. He has helped co-sponsor legislation that would help houses of worship better address the security threats they face. And he has also called for increased funding to prevent further tragedies from transpiring. So without further ado, the video of Senator Gary Peters.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Gary Peters, and thank you to Executive Director Anisha Singh and our panelists who are here to share their community's experience, and to the Sikh Coalition for holding this important discussion. As we mark the solemn 10-year anniversary of the horrific Oak Creek Gowanda attack, each and every one of you serves as a critical voice to help prevent acts of targeted, hateful violence. And as you know all too well, our nation continues to see an unacceptable rise in violent threats and deadly attacks targeting synagogues, African American churches, mosques, and Gowandas across the nation. As you will hear today, from the deadly attack in Oak Creek to the Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, to the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, these acts of violence not only destroy sacred property, they leave deep, traumatic scars on entire communities. No one should fear for their safety when practicing their faith. As chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, I have long fought to ensure houses of worship cultural institutions, and nonprofit organizations all across our nation can improve their security and provide a safe haven for their congregations. As part of the government funding bill signed into law earlier this year, I helped secure $250 million for the Department of Homeland Security's nonprofit security grant program, a critical resource that provides funding to houses of worship and other nonprofit organizations to safeguard their congregations against potential terrorist attacks. And while I'm proud of the funding level we passed last year, the highest in the history of the program, I'm going to continue to fight for Congress to fund this program at $360 million in fiscal year 2023, as well as working to find a path forward on reauthorization language to strengthen the program. And while this program is an important first step, combating this growing threat will also require addressing what our national security agencies say is the most lethal terrorism threat to our nation: domestic terrorism, driven by white supremacists and anti-government extremists. The spread and the amplification of extreme and dangerous content on online platforms can unfortunately translate to real-world violence. And that is why I've also continued to press social media companies about their role in the amplification of misinformation, disinformation, and extremist content. My committee has held several hearings addressing these grave threats, and I raised the need for the federal government to better track data related to domestic terrorism and prioritize their resources and their personnel to keep Americans safe. And I'll continue evaluating what more the federal government can do to address domestic terrorism while respecting the civil rights and civil liberties of all Americans. So thank you again to all of you for your attention to this incredibly important issue, and I look forward to continuing to work together to protect our nation's faith communities. Thank you.
A huge thank you again to Senator Gary Peters for that video submission and his thoughtful remarks. And a thank you again to Senator Durban for joining us live and providing his insight as well. I'd love to now turn it back over to our panelists, where Sim from the Sikh Coalition team is moderating, who is joined by Harpreet Singh Saini from the Oak Creek community, Rabbi Myers, and Pastor Manning. I'll turn it over to you, Sim.
Thank you again, and I want to echo our gratitude for Senator Durban and Senator Peters for being able to share their perspectives at today's briefing. Rabbi Myers, I know we left off with you, and we wanted to talk about your perspectives. What are the deep-rooted issues that you believe contribute to the rise in hate violence and attacks on our houses of worship? We heard from Harpreet, we heard from Pastor Manning. Would love to hear from you. And before we do, just want to remind everyone in the chat, if you've got questions, please put them in, and we will look to answer a couple towards the end of this briefing. Rabbi Myers, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sim. I too want to express appreciation and gratitude for both Senators Durban and Peters for their thoughtful remarks and engagement in this critically important subject matter. Most of us probably don't take a moment to think about the fact that unless you are Native American, at some point your family immigrated here. So that means that we are a nation of immigrants, independent of the horrific genocide of the Native Americans, which is a totally different conversation than today's conversation. The laws that are promulgated at the beginning of this republic did not adequately reflect equality for all human beings here. We still haven't dealt with the horrors of that history, and that even up to the present day, there are those Americans who self-prioritize, create hierarchies, if not caste systems, in the United States. It's as though if you could make the Declaration of Independence in their mind a cafeteria they'll walk through and pick out the things that they like that refer to them, and the things that they like that would only specifically refer to any one particular group in the United States. I have no doubt that in today's conversations, we're once again preaching to the choir. So I think the root of one of the major questions that I struggle with regularly is, how do you reach the members of those groups that are not in the choir? Is it that they sing a different tune? They're not even interested in being in the choir. So I struggle first with, how do you reach them? Which is not something that I've really come up with the answer with yet, only just thoughts that keep bouncing around in my head. We've talked about the importance of education. Yes, as Proverbs say, you can't know someone unless you walk a mile in their shoes. I've said it a number of times. I know Pastor Manning probably could recite it verse and chapter, these sorts of thoughts, that from my perspective, we live in silos in America. And in that silo are the people who are just like us, in whatever ways we self-determine that to be. For many people, they're unable to have connectors between those silos. So because of those lack of connectors, we don't know our neighbors. I'm grateful. I live in the neighborhood where Fred Rogers lived, 6 blocks from his home. He understood this really well, that you need to reach children to get to know your neighbors. In my day going to school, we used to have something called civics. And it wasn't just about learning the Declaration of Independence or constitutional law. It was more about understanding the nature of what it meant to be a citizen in the United States and our responsibilities towards one another. We've lost that ability to appreciate our neighbors. Tolerance is no longer sufficient. We need to go beyond tolerance for love and respect of all of our neighbors, to get to know them better. Because I think once you get to know them, we'll discover we're 99 and 44 100% identical in whom we are. We all have the same wants, desires, and needs. So yes, education, critically important. The challenge becomes with states' rights, each state sets their own standards. But I think we could find some ways to be able to agree on certain important principles when it comes to the education of young people, to be able to know their neighbors. I frankly think that we should have a comparable sort of course in your freshman year in college. I can recall in my days in college, which I think is probably still true, there were 4 courses that every student as a freshman, if you are privileged to go to college, would have to take. There was no out for it. I think we need to grow that by adding a comparable civics type of course about getting to know your neighbor, not just world faiths, but different cultures, everyone's experiences, because when you know people better, you're more likely then to have better appreciation for who they are and better understanding of who they are, and be able to think twice before you act in a way that would be inappropriate, if not dangerous. So education is just such a critically important thing. And let's not stop with college students. I wouldn't see any reason to not have, say, in every house of worship in the United States, like a 6 or 8 week class on world religions. Each session learns something about another faith. I think you maybe knew Harpreet who said it, that most Americans probably know very little about what it means to be Sikh at all. They have fear. And fear leads us down that negative path towards violence. When they understand what it means to be a Sikh, there can be an appreciation, a love, and a respect for what a beautiful faith the Sikh religion is. But when you don't know it, you don't have that. So it seems to me a set of 6 or 8 classes each week, a different faith, so we can understand better faiths. To me, I think that's just a critical piece to grow education. It starts at the kitchen table. You learn from your parents. If you learn at an early age, love and appreciation, you will be one who lives a life with love and appreciation. If you learn from an early age, the H word, as I call it, you're going to live a life that's corrosive from the inside. So I think we've been at a crossroads for a long time. It's never too late. That's why I just choose to focus on the education piece, because you can't legislate away H. You can't. You can't legislate away the words. You can't legislate away the actions people will perform, because those who perform it clearly do not have any concern from personal consequences. So with all due respect to all of our legislators, there's more that I think it's more grassroots that we've got to do to fill in those gaps. It's a big burden, but I think it's one that we must arise and meet head on.
Thank you, Rabbi. And this is a question for all the panelists, but I think, Rabbi, you're probably best suited to answer this first, because you talked a little bit about beta testing some programs that can help improve the lives of our communities. And to that point, Oak Creek happened 10 years ago, and more houses of worship and minority communities have come under attack since then. Each attack is a painful reminder that current approaches by the federal government are not meeting the needs and expectations to keep our communities safe from hate violence. Could you point us to any local or state efforts by community members or by local or state government that may be instructive in how the federal government could better respond to the threat of white supremacist violence and the targeting of our houses of worship? Rabbi Myers, I'll turn it to you.
Yep. I agree that you can't throw money at it and just think that'll fix it, because we're grateful for these grants that communities get. They're one-time grants, which frequently go towards hardware and software. Once all of that money is spent, now you have to spend the money on personnel. There is no budget for that in most houses of worship. Where do you find the money for? It could be $100,000 a year, if not more, to engage personnel when federal money can't do that. So we're all struggling with how do we keep our worshipers safe, yet keep an open environment. I think the local levels are the most instructive to be able to find ways to work together. I'll just give you a simple example, which I did in my own house of worship. Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday celebration weekend. What I've done for the past, I think it's 2 years now, is had a interfaith exchange weekend with a Black church in what we call the Historic Hill District in Pittsburgh, where most of the Black community lives. So on the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath, which is a Saturday, we invited members of that church, as well as their pastor, to come worship with us. And the pastor gave the sermon in lieu of me. That Sunday, my congregation went to worship in the church. And I, instead of giving a sermon, I actually took the words of the late Senator John Lewis, Representative John Lewis of blessed memory, that had been set to like a biblical text, and I chanted it using ancient Hebrew chant, but in English. A simple matter like that of interfaith exchange, dialogue, and conversation. I know here in Pittsburgh, it's supported by elected leaders on all levels. It's supported by interfaith dialogue groups, a range of people, so that these initiatives are not funded. They're not really an expensive thing to do. In the case of holding a service exchange, it's the normative thing to do to hold your religious service. So something like that, it doesn't cost money. So what it requires is bravery, to be able to step outside your comfort zone and to be able to say, you know, I don't know much about that group. Let me reach out. Let me find maybe a person that can connect me with that faith leader, and be brave to take that first step and be honest to say, I don't know much about your faith. I've read some. Can you help teach me? And through me, we can then create a partnership and grow and move beyond our safe zones to move into areas of greater understanding. Trying to do that here, I think that's just some really small steps, but I think small steps can lead to greater steps. So I don't think these really require expenses per se. It requires just bravery and comfort with who you are to know that this is the right way.
Thank you, Rabbi. Harpreet, I want to turn it over to you. Could you point us to any local or state efforts by community members or local or state government that could be instructive on how the federal government could be doing more to address the threats that we face?
Yeah. What we have done to secure our Gurdwara has come from ourselves, not the government. We have a security guard now. We have someone watching the cameras at all times. As I said earlier, some of this is sad because Gurdwaras are supposed to be open to everyone, but we have to be safe. We got a lot of attention from a government officials and media right after the shooting. So many people came to visit or check in one time, and then they never came back. It was like they were checking a box before moving on. As the years went by, we saw less and less interest to keep our community safe. Now there seems to be more deadly attacks in house of worship, but resources aren't getting into the hand of the communities that need the most help.
Harpreet, thank you for sharing that perspective. Pastor Manning, I saw you nodding your head as Harpreet was talking about some of his remarks in terms of what could be done here. I would love to turn to you and hear your perspective.
Yeah, I agree realistically with Harpreet as well. Now, of course, we have cameras and we have to buzz people in. If we don't have security in, then we do not let people come in to visit. And I was agreeing from that particular perspective. It's a completely different paradigm now that we are in. From what Charleston has done, and I applaud the leadership several years ago, they started being intentional. I believe it did make national news. The city offered an apology for slavery. They owned it. They acknowledged it. They weren't going to hide behind anything. They just said, this is where we are, and you know what, we are apologizing. Some, of course, thought that the apology was empty because it may not have come with any real type of reforms. But the city has begun to put a committee together. They call it racial conciliation. I still think it should be racial reconciliation, but that's neither here nor there. And they began to, have the difficult, challenging conversations. However, and we still see gentrification taking place. We still see so many underlining racial tensions that come up from time to time. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times we don't have what I like to call the spiritual fortitude. Some have actually said just, Pastor, the moral courage to stand up and to say, we're no longer going to allow this. It goes back to the same comments that I said before. We have to learn how to understand who our neighbor is and begin to dismantle all of the avenues of negative and hateful rhetoric. And yes, we still see it in social media. Yes, we still see it on various news outlets. And I'm thankful for the way that Senator Durban articulated that. But here within Charleston, we began to do the apology for slavery, like I said. And then as well, the mayor and city council did a bold move. A couple of years ago, they removed the Calhoun statue. Calhoun statue was high lifted up, and it basically was the Holocaust memorial was in the shadows of James C. Calhoun, and you could see the statue from Mother Emanuel. So it's not necessarily dismantling the statues. It's not doing, but it's having the courage to say if it offends my citizens, if it offends my neighbor, then you know what? It should offend me because I am now meeting my neighbor on the basis of humanity. And I understand, as I continue to say, that there's more unites us than divides us. And that statue offends them. So you know what? I'm going to remove it. The speech that is being utilized, you know what? I'm going to remove it. The flag that flies, you know what? I'm going to remove it. It's having the courage to take those stands. So again, just to come back to the question within Charleston, we have done some good work, but I do know that there is still a lot of work that has to be done.
Thank you, Pastor. Really appreciate that response and the responses of the Rabbi and Harpreet. And to that end, we're going to ask one more question before we go to question and answer. If anyone has any questions that they want to propose to our panelists, make sure to drop those in the chat and we'll try to answer as many as we can today. But back to our panelists, before we go to our community question and answer session. The burden for change and progress to address hate violence should not lay with our communities, yet it has. Going forward, as we prepare for the next decade after Oak Creek, our members of Congress must pass comprehensive legislation to address hate violence in this country. Pastor Manning, how are federal grant programs like the Nonprofit Security Grant Program working to help bolster security resources for your church? Can you walk us through the accessibility of the process and the challenges you faced in getting the critical funding needed to help your congregation feel safe and prevent another attack from happening?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. And it drives one of the points home that a lot of these grants are available, but sometimes the houses of worship, and I believe to Rabbi's point and to Prateek's point as well, we do not have the necessary skill set to jump quickly. The window opens and then it closes. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get all of the things done in order to apply for the grant. And that has been a challenge. I became aware of the nonprofit security grant, unfortunately, just a couple of months ago. And I did the work. We reached out to several, reached out to here within the state of South Carolina, SLED, and unfortunately, though, we weren't able to get all the requirements done in the short time that was allotted to us. And subsequently now we have to wait again. But you know, during that time, we are still in the need of additional funds to secure our sanctuary. And I realize that Mother Emanuel is not the only church, is not the only house of worship that is in need of these grants. But what I would really like is if there could be a fast track to the places where these heinous acts have taken place, and then they reach out. And I understand there has to be checks and balances. I understand all of that, and then we just work towards expediting so that the funds could be received to whomever has been impacted by these type of things. But I think, unfortunately, Sim, to your point and to the question that you have raised, a lot of these grants have so many things that we have to check off. I understand the government has their requirements, but for some of the houses of worship, the list and the to-do list is so long and lengthy that we cannot get it done. And at times we lack the skill set to push them and to get all and to make sure we could accomplish or complete all of the requirements for the grants.
Thank you, Pastor Manning. I think you've highlighted an issue that I know that the Sikh Coalition is greatly aware of. As a lot of Sikh houses of worship and others are volunteer run, we don't have the professional staff and capacity to take advantage of some of these grants, and it is an ongoing challenge that we need to address. But Rabbi Myers, I wanted to turn our attention to what's been happening recently. The Department of Homeland Security and FBI have cited concerns about a troubling increase in white supremacist violent activity being our nation's most prominent national security threat. As such, are certainly alarming to the Jewish community. But why should all Americans care about the proliferation and the embrace of an extremist white supremacist ideology? What could our government be doing to address the threat of violent white supremacists in our society? Pastor? I'm sorry, Rabbi.
That's right. I'm honored if you call me pastor. So thank you for that honorific. As much as some may think, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. I say that because we didn't create anti-Semitism. There's an old, I think it's a Yiddish expression that kind of says that if Jews didn't exist, the anti-Semites would have to create them so that they could find a group that they didn't like. When any group is attacked in the United States, be it for the color of their skin, their faith, or their sexual orientation, it's not merely an attack upon that group, it's an attack upon America. We know enough to know that if you are anti-Semitic, you are not merely expressing extreme dislike and perhaps violence against the Jewish community. Most likely also within your personal portfolio will be extreme behaviors towards many other minorities in the United States who are not exactly the same as you. But when you express it specifically towards the Jewish people, it goes beyond that. In some cases, it's just the tip of the iceberg, shall we say, of greater problems that we find here in the United States. An inability to understand, love, and appreciate your neighbor, and to be able to work with your neighbor. I don't have an immediate, shall we say, cure, because from a Jewish perspective, anti-Semitism is the world's oldest disease. It's been around as long as the Jewish people have been around, and we've been around for 4,000 years. So it's not going away anytime soon. The question becomes, what does it symptomize in the United States? Senator Alan Simpson said it really well at the funeral for former President George H.W. Bush, when he reflected upon the H word, and he said that it corrodes from the inside. We've got this immense corrosion going on within America. Part of that corrosion is an inability to pause for a moment, look in the mirror, and reflect upon your own situation and think, have I had any impact upon myself that's caused me to be where I am at? In many cases, people don't take that moment. They look for scapegoats elsewhere for their problems, as opposed to thinking, perhaps I might have had some cause for where I'm at. When you can always look for a scapegoat and never take responsibility for your own situation, it's inevitable it's going to lead to a violent act at some point. History has shown that over the millennia, that that's the end product of such behavior. Fixing it is a lot harder because of the nature of humanity. We all know more wars have been fought in the name of religion than any other reason in the history of the world. So certainly religion has a lot to prove to humanity in terms of peace and love for fellow human beings. But I think that we can find ways to rise above this. I know Reverend Dr. King Jr. used to love to quote the prophets, which is perfect because in my eyes, he was a modern prophet. He particularly loved, like the prophet Micah, who would talk about in his speeches that love will flow like a mighty stream. My hope would be that to take that vision and to have this love just wash over the entire country and just wash away all of that. But I think that the washing away is not water. It's love and our humanity that can stand up and be a louder voice than the negative voices, and to wash away all of this evil that threatens to take over the country. The silent majority has to stop being silent. They've got to rise up and be the vocal majority and say, no, this is not okay. This is not acceptable in America. Until those voices can rise up and be the majority, the vocal minority is going to continue to bully America. It's time to rise up to these bullies.
Thank you, Rabbi Myers. Appreciate your response. Harpreet, before we go to the Q&A, I want to turn it over to you. Your testimony 10 years ago asked for the federal government to track hate crimes better. That ask has been a continued request of leading national civil rights organizations working to combat hate. The FBI began collecting more types of bias categories, including anti-Sikh, and reintroduced anti-Arab classifications. But not much else was done to help address hate violence. The FBI's hate crime statistics only capture approximately 3% of hate crimes occurring annually. The reason for this severe underreporting of hate crime statistics are partly due to the voluntary nature of the hate crime statistics program. What can members of Congress do to address the concerns you raised in your testimony and better track hate crimes in this country?
Tracking more hate crimes was an important first step, but the government needs to require law enforcement agencies to submit hate crime data. Otherwise, we still aren't getting the full picture. If we cannot track the spread of hate, how can we prevent another Oak Creek, Charleston, or Pittsburgh shooting? Without this information, how do we know if our government is keeping us safe? Oak Creek had a extraordinary police officer, Lieutenant Brian Murphy, who was shot 15 times by the man who attacked our Gurdwara. He inspired my brother Kamal to become a police officer. Lieutenant Murphy even bought Kamal the same bulletproof vest that saved his life that day. Lieutenant Murphy has spoken about hate violence and hate crimes many times since. Law enforcement has to know what hate crimes are and why they matter. You might not understand why someone ripping off a turban is an act of hate if you don't know what a Sikh is.
That's very sharp words, Harpreet, and I think really on point to some of the challenges that many of our communities are facing as it relates to feeling safe and protected. Given the time constraints that we have, I want to limit question and answers to 1 minute for each of our panelists. We have some great questions. We have 2 questions from the audience that I'd like to combine here. What can we do as American citizens in our everyday lives to prevent hate? And what can faith communities do to promote awareness and interfaith connection? Pastor Manning, why don't we start with you for 1 minute, and then we'll turn it over to Rabbi and then Harpreet.
Well, thank you for that question. I think realistically it goes back to what Rabbi said a minute ago. We need to have those courageous conversations at our table, because a lot of it begins with us. It begins with what happens in our smaller nuclei. Also then, from a house of worship perspective, again, Rabbi had a great suggestion in that regard, beginning by dismantling a lot of these the walls that we have built. I was doing a Bible study earlier today. We have erected these religious walls that divide us. And what we must do from a religious community is be courageous enough to tell the truth, and then to dismantle those walls, and to encourage everyone to meet, like I said before, on the basis of our collective humanity.
Rabbi Myers, if you could provide 1 minute, that would be greatly appreciated.
I'll try to rise up to that challenge. I agree with what Pastor Manning just said, so I don't need to touch upon those. I just wanted to briefly just a pinch deeper on something you said earlier, which I've spoken about as well. All of our elected officials on any level also model behavior. When they misbehave, they give us permission to misbehave. That means when they speak ill of someone else, regardless of who that is, they're saying, I'm doing it, I give you permission to do it. We need to hold them to a higher level. We need to demand civility. We need to demand tolerance. We need to demand that they show loving kindness to each other. That has to be part of the job description. And we need to demand it of all of them, whether it's someone running for elective office or someone who is currently elected. Because when they behave in a manner that we find unacceptable and gives permission to anyone out there who wants to say, well, so-and-so does that, I'm just following in their footsteps. Imagine if someone said, well, I'm going to be good to my neighbor because, and they mentioned a particular elected official models that. It would be lovely if you could see in the well of the Senate, 2 senators who stand up, one from each party, and say, we make a pledge, we're not going to ever use the H word again. The question is, where do we have courageous leadership on all levels of government, from city, state, federal, to be able to show that courageous leadership that they reject the H word and all that it stands for?
Harpreet, I want to turn it over to you if you had any views that you could share with us in 60 seconds.
I still think the education part is the most important part. Educating your kids, educating your loved ones on who Sikhs are. It's a matter of just education, knowing what culture you're studying. I think that's the most important aspect of it.
Thank you, Harpreet. I don't know if our panelists have any additional time to join us. If you want to give me a thumbs up, then we'll know. If not, I'll make sure to conclude today's. Oh, we got 3 thumbs up. So I think we can ask a couple more questions if you, because I think that we're receiving so many great community questions. One of the questions that we have here for Pastor Manning is a wonderful response on how to stop hate speech. Specifically, when you were talking about meeting your neighbor, and if something offends them, then it should offend you. What response would you give to people who say it's a part of their history, that their flag hung or their statue go up in part of history, and that led to freedom in time, and that history cannot be erased? I feel as though it is a common response from those who oppose change, and it is difficult to change their mind. Pastor Manning, that question specifically for you from the chat.
Well, thank you again for that question. I think realistically, I'm not saying that we should change history. I mean, you can't. You have to own it. And realistically speaking, and some people say that it's part of their heritage. It's this. I think that is realistically a cop-out, because you are then saying your feelings are not important. You're not validating me as a citizen of this country. And I think realistically, the history in this country is so at times very dark and very hurtful, especially from the Black, brown community, and to Rabbi's point as well, the Jewish community, when we don't take time to understand that the truth of the history, and it's not to offend anyone. I know a lot of people now are talking about, as we said before, we heard Senator Durban, the replacement theory, but that is realistically debunked. We need to understand the history of the country, the challenges that there were in, and then say, you know what, it was painful back then, it's painful now. Let us look for common ground. Here's a word that we have forgotten that has left our vernacular. Let us find a compromise. Let us find a way to move forward together. Because if we can find a way to move forward together, then we are strengthening all of our collective communities. Everyone's voice matters. Everyone's life matters. Everyone's dignity matters. And as I said before, it's not easy. I can sit here and say it today, but the challenge of putting something like this and helping people understand is hard. But I believe that if we have, as Rabbi said, and as Harpreet has said as well, if our elected officials lift up the standard, if those who are in mainstream media that we watch day in and day out lift up the standard and say this is no longer going to be tolerated, I can embrace Fox News, I can embrace MSNBC, I can embrace CNBC, I can embrace whomever, because we are all Americans, we are all human beings, and we all have certain things that will always unite us. Love for our families, love for our communities, and the challenge is then having that love for each other. So I appreciate the question. I think a lot of times people say, well, that's part of our heritage. I get it. But I think realistically, if I love my neighbor as I love myself, I will never offend myself. I will never do anything that will disrespect myself. So I think that's really, my opinion. But as I said, I sit here in Charleston, South Carolina, in my little world. And I think from time to time, people say I'm too opinionated, but I think this is one that I would really hope that we would embrace, make our communities a lot better. Thank you for the question again.
Thank you, Pastor, and thank you for our audience for sharing some wonderful questions. And apologies if we didn't get to yours. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This conversation is just the beginning of many more to come. And before we end today's briefing, we have one final question for our panelists. We have in attendance at today's briefing hardworking Hill staff committed to finding ways to keep our communities safe from acts of hate violence. If you had one thing to say to them on what can be done to address the issue, what would you tell them? Harpreet, why don't we start with you?
Okay. After Oak Creek, our local, state, and federal government asked communities like mine to do our part to help save lives. We are working together, strengthening our security, and sharing what we have learned in a meeting like this one. Now our government has to take action as well. 10 years after Oak Creek, we have seen small action by our government to save lives. This is not enough. We need Congress and the president to work with organizations like Sikh Coalition to create new ways to protect our communities. I also still believe education is important. Every state needs to make sure that teachers provide accurate information about all of the religions, race, and other groups that make up our community or make up our country. That's something that I didn't have when I was growing up, but it could have made a big difference to me. We cannot and should not accept this violence as a normal part of life in America. My mother and so many others would have still be alive today if we took strong actions. Now is the time to do so.
Thank you, Harpreet, for that powerful reminder that we need action. Rabbi Myers, I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sim. Thank you, Harpreet, for such an important answer. I would say to Hill staffers, get to know each other. You're really an important community because you are the gatekeepers for the elected officials that you're the staff of. You're the ones who control the information flow of what they learn and what they know, because with all the committees and things that they're involved in, it's impossible to keep track of everything that's necessary. So you're a critical cog in how our government runs and how effective it can be. But I would say that when you get to know each other and move beyond your comfort zone to a vast, immense community of Hill staffers and know each other, your representation of what the best as America to offer, bring that best with you and encourage the elected official that you are part of the staff of to see to it that that best that it can offer is available to every single citizen of the United States. until that occurs, your job is not done.
Thank you, Rabbi Myers. Some really powerful words as well in terms of the realities for how constituencies engage with their elected officials. Pastor Manning, I want to turn it over to you before we give it to Anisha to close this out. But would love to learn your words of advice for the hardworking Hill staff in attendance today.
I thank everyone for their words already. I will just sum it up as this: do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season you will reap if you faint not. Don't faint. Continue to press forward, for you will make a difference in all of our collective communities. So I thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Manning. Anisha, I want to turn it over to you to close this out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sim, for seamlessly moderating such a critical conversation today. And thank you to all of our panelists for your courage, strength, and voice today and every day as we move tragedy to action. Harpreet Singh Saini of the Oak Creek, Wisconsin Sikh community, Pastor Eric S.C. Manuel, the senior pastor of the historic Mother Emanuel A.M.E. Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and Rabbi Jeffrey Meyers, the Rabbi and Cantor for Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And gratitude to Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, and Congresswoman Grace Meng of New York for their commitment and leadership by joining us today and delivering their remarks. We hope the conversation we had today inspires those in attendance, whether staff of members of Congress, community members, or coalition partners. To advance legislation we discussed today, lean into difficult conversations to educate those around us and drive our collective pain to action. And finally, as we often say here at the Sikh Coalition, we urge you to practice your faith fearlessly. Thank you for joining us.